5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hey everybody, this is Ben, the amateur exegete here, and this is another episode of Amateur Hour, and I've got here with me Mark Edward. You should remember Mark because he's been on here two other times. We've done, what did we do? Pauline Christology, I think was one of them, and then we did one in the Book of Revelation.
Yep.
So, and those were more formal interviews. Today we're kind of it's gonna be a little more loosey-goosey, kind of informal. Uh, Mark and I have kind of dialogued offline to come up with a list of topics that will hopefully be interesting. It's interesting to us. I don't know anything about most of them, but Mark is the is the expert. So, Mark, before we kind of get into stuff, why don't you just briefly introduce yourself and your website and all that?
My name is Mark Edward. Um, I have been Bible blogging, contemplating, meditating for uh, probably close to 20 years now, in various forms. But right now, my website is a BibleDarkly.com. That's the one it's the URL I've stuck with the longest. Uh, yeah, I mean, I usually write kind of deep dive essays, but every now and then I take it easy and I'll do lighter surveys of a topic or just a tiny little blurb about something I've been interested in lately. This year in general, I've been kind of taking it easy just to not get burnt out
Yeah.
on these deep dives.
Yeah, the isn't your YouTube channel also called A Bible Darkly? All three of the videos on
What
your
what
YouTube.
YouTube channel?
You didn't take it down, did you?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Uh, don't play with me. You know, now I'm nervous because you had videos up there. You had, I think, two or three videos. And I know I'm subscribed. Well, I'll have to check later. Don't do that to me. All right. Well, and just so anybody who's watching this, if you're interested, Mark has an interview up with Derek Lambert on Myth Vision about his story. And I've not finished it. I'm halfway through, and his story is really interesting. It's just a different kind of trajectory from me, but he and Derek seem to have gotten along pretty well in the video. I think you
Yeah,
guys had a similar
our
story.
personal stories, his
Yeah.
and my personal stories had like these really weird
They
coincidental
intersect.
parallels.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the
And it
preterism
sounds like
thing.
we were kind of getting into similar topics and around the same time as each other. As far as I know, we never interacted until this year.
How is he? I don't know how old Derek is. You're in your 30s. I know that, but
Yeah,
uh he must be in his 30s.
I think he's maybe about my age. No, I think he's actually a year younger than me.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. Okay. Well, so you and I talked offline, texted to come up with a bunch of topics. Some of them, I like I said, I know nothing about, or I know very little about. But all of them are really, really interesting.
You say
So
that like I know what I'm talking about.
oh, please, listen, man. Okay, I've sseen your website. It's methodical. It's organized. It's scholarly. So you're an amateur like me, but you are just really, and you got a fantastic memory. Like I don't understand. I hate you for it. Because I have to take copious notes. I read a book. I have to take lots of notes. Um, and 5 minutes later, I've forgotten everything I've taken notes on. So, but
My
you've got this.
memory extends as far as the information itself, but when it comes to the author or the book titles, that stuff just goes right out of my brain.
Oh, I'm the opposite. I like to remember who wrote stuff, but I think that's because I can't remember the content. So it's kind of like a shortcut. Hey, it's this book. You just
Yeah,
pull it off
yeah.
the
If you know where
shelf.
to look.
Exactly, exactly. So the first topic we're going to talk about is an article that appeared on John Nelson's website, behindthegospels.com. And so, for those who don't know John, he is, um, well, he just finished his PhD, I think, last year. He's known well among the McGrew crew. So those who follow Tim and Lydia McGrew, because he's a pretty vocal opponent of like undesigned coincidences and that kind of argumentation. Um, and and John and I have talked some on Facebook. We've messaged before and talked about, different stuff related to New Testament studies and whatnot. He's a brilliant, just an absolutely brilliant guy. So have you ever interacted with him at all, Mark?
As far as I know, I don't think so.
No.
I
Yeah.
I wasn't even familiar with his name until you sent the link.
Oh, really? Okay.
Which
Well, you're
that could
not.
be my fault. I'm not on Twitter anymore.
Well, exactly. Yeah. He's not on Twitter all that often, at least not lately. I mean, I've been kind of staying off it too, but um so yeah, but either way, he's got this website behindthegospels.com looking at kind of um the history, the composition of the gospels. But he wrote an article. Oh, how long ago was it? It was, let's see, pull it up real quick. But it was, back in May, called "A New Argument for the Empty Tomb," and he's quoting scholars like, um, was it Bruce Ware, I believe? Yeah, John Granger Cook.
Mhm.
And the argument essentially is that, Paul doesn't know, or some people think they read Paul's statements about, like in the Corinthian Creed, Jesus was buried, but he doesn't mention an empty tomb. He never goes into those traditions that are found in the Synoptic Gospels and John. So perhaps he didn't know them, but this argument says the language of resurrection, specifically words like the verb agero, um,
And
suggests.
anistemy.
Yeah, that's the other one. Yep. These terms suggest that a tomb is presupposed.
Right.
At least that's
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 the
what I
argument.
that's the essential argument. So uh, I don't know.
It's not just that, it's also that the New Testament doesn't use the word for "in assent" when referring to the resurrection, which is so
Yeah,
the idea is, um, the criticism, if you want to call it that, the critical academic opinion that is kind of emerging right now, at least in regards to Paul's letters, is that he maybe thought of the resurrection and the ascension as the same thing. That Jesus
yeah,
rising from the dead was the moment he was translated into heaven.
yeah,
And the counter argument to that is the word for ascension on a basis isn't used that way in the New Testament, let alone by Paul. That the language used, agero and anistemi, refers to a physical standing up, and therefore must refer to a body rising from physical death in plain sight, like visible and tangible, rather than
yeah.
going into heaven.
But why would that? So here's my issue with it. Just, and this is just off the cuff. Um, why does that entail the existence of a tomb? Like, why would you? Because I think the goal of the argument is to somehow bring Paul in line with what the synoptics tell us. And
Yes.
but I don't see any reason to think. And just to be clear, in case John watches this, I'm not saying John's making this argument or he's,
No, he. I think
just
he asks the same question you are.
yeah, he's presenting the information and he's just doing a really good job of kind of asking questions about it. But I've read Ware's article. It's been a few years now, and I was kind of um taken aback by it. I thought, well, this kind of makes sense that maybe he's implying an empty tomb, but it wouldn't mean then that he either knows the traditions or even that the kind of tomb he has in mind is the kind of tomb envisioned in the Gospels. I
Right.
mean, there's just I don't see any reason. I've always read that passage in First Corinthians, and I don't know about you, but I've always read like, well, yeah, Paul thinks Jesus physically rose from the dead. I mean, he uses a different word. He doesn't use the word for, like he explicitly says it wasn't what bodily. I think he uses the word soma. It's a spiritual body. It's a refined body. But
Yeah. Refined material, but
yeah,
material.
it's still material. Exactly, it's still material. Pneuma was always material, especially in if you read Stoic thought and some of the other ancient philosophers. But that being said, so I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. I think that maybe it's kind of like when people argue that when Paul says in First Corinthians 11 about the Lord's Supper that
Mhm.
on the night that he was the verb is paradidomi, it literally means handed over, but some translations say betrayed. People look at that and say, "Oh, he knows something
They
about a
they
betrayal."
pull something out of that word more than what it
Well,
means by
they're
itself.
filtering it through the lens
Yeah.
of the Gospels, and Paul didn't have the Gospels. I mean, there's no evidence that he did. So I don't know. So what are some of your thoughts about the article, Mark? What are you
I
at?
think, I mean, I liked the point he gets at the end, which is essentially to ask the same question you are, which is the if you even want to call it ambiguity, it's not ambiguity, it's just silence on the matter from Paul. Paul's
Yeah.
not ambiguous, he just doesn't say anything about it. And
Yeah, yeah,
like what we don't have a reason to find a tomb out of his letters. He doesn't mention it. And if he doesn't mention it, we don't have a reason to assume it unless we're specifically trying to harmonize him with the synoptics and
yeah.
John. Um, I have like kind of this array of thoughts. One of them is the tomb doesn't matter for Paul.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like
Yes.
the fact he doesn't mention the tomb, the place where Jesus was buried, is completely irrelevant to him. If it
Yep.
was important, he would have mentioned it.
Yep.
He takes the time to mention, hey, there's 500 witnesses to Jesus being risen from the dead. He doesn't point to the place where Jesus was buried being empty.
Yeah.
So as far as Paul cares, the tomb is irrelevant. It's not a point for him. It's an apologetic for later generations of Christians. And that's the second point is it becomes an apologetic. They start pointing to it like with Mark, the women found it empty, but they didn't say anything. And then Matthew and Luke and John, they start to elaborate it more. And then you have the Gospel of Peter, who makes a big freaking deal out of how an entire cohort of centurions and like the priests and stuff saw the tomb being opened and Jesus' cross exiting it. And like there's witnesses galore. The further the story gets away from historical reality,
Yeah.
which means the further away you're getting, the more it becomes an apologetic. But when you're in the earliest generation, Paul, and even Mark, if you want to say, uh, it's almost irrelevant.
But
So
it is strange though, just to kind of push back. Um, it is strange that when Paul, assuming that it is a creed there in First Corinthians 15,
yeah,
why does the creed mention being buried at all? Like, what is the purpose of having that there? Like, it's almost like because like he says he was crucified or he according to the scriptures, he was buried and he was raised according to the scriptures. Like the
mm-hmm.
whole empty or the whole buried part is just so sometimes it feels like it's just thrown in there. Like, is
I've
it?
always gotten the vibe that like he calls this a tradition that he's received, or that the Corinthians have received. I forget exactly what it is. Um,
Yeah, that which I handed down to you that
yeah,
I received. Yeah, and using that verb paradidomi. Yeah,
and it's I take it that he's got these these three main points: crucified, buried, rose from the dead, according to the scripture. So he's got some kind of scriptural basis in mind. But as we already know, especially as we see in his letters and in the Gospels, they're finding stuff in the Hebrew Bible
yeah, there.
that it really has nothing to do with Jesus. So like they're seeing things that make them think of him. So if they find something that talks about, for example, just the way Matthew uses the sign of Jonah,
Yeah,
and he elaborates it way more than we find in Luke, where he turns it into this point about Jonah being in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights
yeah,
specifically correlates to Jesus. That could easily be the kind of thing Paul's referring to. And in which case that has nothing to do with burial in a tomb. It's just Jesus being interred in the earth somehow. whether that's a mass grave or a private tomb that's a poor man's tomb or a rich guy's tomb. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's just it's incidental to the argument that he's making. It's not like you just said before. You said it's not integral to what he's trying to get at. His
Yeah,
Paul wants to get to the resurrection. That's his bread and butter. The tomb
right.
being empty may be just a consequence, or the place wherever Jesus was buried is just, his body being gone is the consequence of that resurrection. But, it's not as if he needs to elaborate on it, or maybe he didn't know it all. Maybe just, yeah, I got a creed, so here we go.
Yeah. And
So,
one of the points was that New Testament doesn't use the word on a basis,
yeah.
the ascent or ascension, to refer to the resurrection. I feel like that is kind of ambiguous in a couple of places, actually. In there's I think Ephesians 4, where Paul talks about Jesus descending to rescue people in captivity, or whatever the phrasing is,
Hmm.
and then in the ascension up. And the well, not Paul, the author of Ephesians, but the parallelism there, the parallel is a descent, a catabasis,
Yeah.
and an ascent, anabasis, where the descent is death,
Yeah.
and the death takes you into Hades, Sheol, whatever, whereas the ascent takes them into heaven. And if the descent is death, then the ascent, plausibly, according to that author, could be interpreted as resurrection.
Well, and to piggyback on that, the in Philippians 2, that the hymn, the Carmen Christi, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
it could be a poem. The logic of that seems to point to immediate ascension. Therefore God has highly exalted him and given him the name,
Mm-hmm.
etc. So
Yeah,
to me, it reads like he died, and then the resurrection is it's not conflated. It's part of the ascension. Like he's
yeah,
in heaven now. Like that's just where he is. Paul seems to argue that this is what happened to Jesus, that he dies and his resurrection takes him right up to heaven.
yeah.
Um, but
I think if we didn't have the Gospels and we only had Paul, I feel like that would be the natural conclusion to take from his
yeah,
letters, is
yeah,
that resurrection means Jesus is in heaven. It
yeah.
doesn't mean he walked around on earth for 40 days.
Well, and it's only Luke who bothers to have a story at all.
You get my point.
Yeah,
The fact
yeah,
that Jesus would be walking around at all, like, that's
yeah,
not in
yeah.
Paul.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. The appearances are
Um,
visions, and yeah, exactly.
there's one point that I kind of wish Nelson had pushed back on a little bit, and I understand why he might not have done it. It's near the end of his article where he quotes from Dale Allison,
Hmm.
where Allison is arguing against this interpretation of Cook or Ware, about the language, and like it's just, it lacks force, essentially.
Yeah.
But even in his argument against his peers, Allison still says something to the effect of, I think that Paul probably knew a tradition, or maybe even a text, resembling Mark 16 verses 1 through 8.
Yeah.
Like, he says, I suspect Paul might have even known this. Like, on what grounds?
Yeah. Why?
Like, why do you suspect this, other than maybe you're trying to harmonize Paul with the Gospels? Like,
Yeah.
that's the only reason I can think for why Allison would suspect such a thing. Because to me, when you look at Mark, the earliest of our Gospels, the one that all the other Gospels are based on, all the other narrative Gospels anyway, when you look at Mark 15 and 16, there's the historical ground of a guy named Jesus from Nazareth being
Mhm.
crucified for some political accusation. Uh, but beyond that, the entire narrative that we have in Mark 15 and 16 is so thoroughly editorialized by the author, where
Yeah.
he's reshaped this history based on how he interprets this, Psalm 22, or Isaiah 53, or anything like here and there, all over the place, even maybe a little bit of First Enoch. Um,
Yeah.
the author's not concerned with history. And if he's not concerned with history, and he's for lack of a better term, inventing parts of this narrative that easily could include this notion of an empty tomb.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not to say that Jesus could not have been buried, like the historical person could not have been buried in a tomb of some kind, but Mark's author doesn't know what that story is. The story
Yeah.
he's presenting is essentially his invention.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably right. Let's move on because we don't have a lot of time and there's a lot
Sure.
to cover. Um, so let's talk about Paul. So you mentioned uh Ephesians being a Pauline text that is not Pauline. Um, so that kind of raises the issue of not only the letters themselves, but the order in which they were probably written.
Yeah.
Because the order that we have them in the New Testament is not, I mean, it's not the order they were written in. They're written in largest document to smallest document according to churches and then to individuals.
Yeah.
So Romans, even though it's first in the New Testament, in terms of Paul's letters, is by no means the first that was written.
Most
So
likely the last.
yeah, exactly. Most likely the last. So let's kind of talk about Pauline chronology and um, in terms of the letters. Where do you fall? Because a lot of scholars they'll use two pieces of data, right? They'll use the letters themselves, and then they'll use the Acts of the Apostles,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll use those two sources um, to come up with a chronology. So, um, what do you think about that? About that technique first, and then let's talk about where do you think the books fall in order.
So I've actually been kind of digging into this topic lately. Uh, and I forget what it was exactly that kicked it off. I think it was, I might have been having a conversation with somebody and I just had the thought of how do we build a chronology of Paul's like career?
Hmm.
Uh, because like as far as I know, it's always been based on Acts. And in my opinion, Acts is entirely unreliable as a historical document. Um, not to say it has absolutely nothing that it can offer us about early Christianity or even about Paul himself, but that so much of it, again, is editorialized by the author and also outright invented that it makes it difficult to find that information to determine which parts are more historically reliable.
Yeah.
Um, and without Acts, how do we know how do we know what order Paul wrote his letters?
Yeah, because Acts seems, I mean, maybe it's just because it's it carries such a heavy weight in the New Testament. It's a huge book. It's part two of a series, and it just seems like it should help determine, where Paul's letters fall.
Right.
But yeah, keep going.
So yeah, I think we have to set Acts aside for reconstructing, or at least attempting to reconstruct the chronology of Paul's letters.
Yeah.
And that's in addition to setting aside some of the letters, because about half of the ones in the New Testament were not written by Paul. They were forgeries, or to be a polite, some of them are Deutero-Pauline.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe not maliciously deceptive the way I think the pastorals could be, but Colossians, Ephesians, and possibly Second Thessalonians, I'm not quite as convinced there. Um, at the very least, might be from somebody who maybe possibly could have perhaps known Paul and
Yeah.
thought they were passing on his tradition, but it's been filtered through their own theology at a later time. But we still have to set those aside because if Paul didn't write them, then they don't reflect his thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I
Okay,
was
so
curious.
what letters first? What letter must be first? Because we got Romans, First and Second Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, First and Second Thessalonians, First and Second Timothy, Titus, and then Philemon or
Don't forget
Philemon.
Hebrews. Everybody forgets Hebrews.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, I didn't forget it. I chose
Throughout
to
Hebrews,
ignore it.
because it doesn't even say it was written by Paul. Throughout the three pastorals, because they definitely were not written by Paul. Um, I would say you have to at least get rid of Ephesians because it's a copy paste expansion of Colossians. And Colossians, I think I'm more convinced that Colossians is not authentic. I know there's a little bit of give and take
Yeah.
there, but I'm not convinced it's authentic. I think it's just too different. And then the remaining 8, there's Second Thessalonians. Second Thessalonians is the one that's usually thrown out. I'm personally not convinced against its authenticity. Not to say I'm 100% sure,
Yeah.
but I think it's quite a bit more likely to be authentic than at least those other 5.
Yeah.
So we got 7, maybe 8. So out of those maybe 8, I would say that Second Thessalonians would have to be the first if it's authentic, and if not Second Thessalonians, then First Thessalonians. Um,
Yeah. So because we talked about this offline, you were willing to put Second Thessalonians ahead of First Thessalonians, assuming Second Thessalonians was authentic, and
right,
that seemed pretty wild to me. Like I never thought of it that way.
and I could be entirely wrong on why I think this. Um, my thought process as I'm reading them, I'm so the way I went about it, I took all the letters and I put them into a document, a text document, and I used Control F replace to find any references to people, places, or events in Paul's
Mhm.
career. And I would like, all the people I would highlight in red, all the places, any mention of a location would be highlighted in blue, and then events would be like other colors to kind of keep track of certain things in Paul's life that he seemed to be referring to here or there. And then maybe those are the same thing. And when I started putting those together, the idea I got was that Second Thessalonians, if it is authentic, seems to be referring to some emergent crisis in the Thessalonian church, like some kind of present crisis or suffering or whatever you want to call it. I think the word might be thlipsis, tribulation.
Yeah, tribulation. Yeah, yeah.
Whereas First Thessalonians also seems to be referring to in a recently emergent tribulation among the
Mhm.
Thessalonian church, but it seems to put it a little bit more in the past. Like it's something that happened, it's recent, but it's not contemporary with when the letter's being written. And I could be wrong with how I'm interpreting that, but that's the way it read to me.
Oh yeah. I see. I don't read First Thessalonians that way. Like especially when you read like chapter 3, when Paul's like, I couldn't get back to you, so I had to send Timothy. I was really worried. Timothy's just come back and he's giving me a good report. That to me reads super urgent, super recent. Um, like maybe a month. I mean, I can't. I mean, it's impossible to narrow it down, but
Right.
that. It just feels. But I can see where you're coming from though, because it does look like in Second Thessalonians there's a new crisis that's emerged. Paul has to give them, hey, there's a specific timetable of the end, and you're not there yet. You're okay. Because
Right.
in First Thessalonians 4, they're worried about, well, my loved ones have died, right? Are they going to be part of the coming of Christ when he returns? And so he's addressing that. You could easily envision it being the opposite, that they're super concerned about the timetable of the end because loved ones are on the verge of dying. So he knocks that out in Second Thessalonians. And then in First Thessalonians, they've died. So now he's got to talk about that. So I don't know. There might be something to it. You might be onto something. I don't
I
know.
mean, it could be backwards from what I'm thinking, but
Yeah.
that's just the way it jumped out to me.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I'd almost buy that. If I thought Second Thessalonians was authentic, I'm not quite there yet. I might be getting there. Um, but that is interesting um, that you came up with that. So right now we're going to take a quick break and then we'll rejoin with Mark to talk more about Pauline chronology. So we'll be right back. All right, we are back. I am talking to Mark Edward, who is I don't know, Should I call you an expert? Would that be
No,
okay? No, don't
no.
do that. No, no, he's a fellow amateur like me. He's just got a way better memory. Good Lord. So we were talking about the Pauline corpus and the dating, or the not the dating, but the order of the letters. But maybe we should talk about the dating because well, let's hold off on that. So
I'll say real quick. I don't think there's any way we can date those letters. There's just not enough information. So like I'll see a commentary here or there. You sent me a screenshot of something the other day, uh, where like they pin it down to the exact month when First Thessalonians or First Corinthians was written. I
yeah.
just don't think that's possible.
Well, that was Douglas Campbell. Okay, so he's got that chapter in the TNT handbook on the
Yeah.
historical Paul.
Oh, it's
And
not just him though. I've seen it all over the place. Like, oh,
well,
the First
yeah,
Thessalonians was written in 50 CE in the spring, maybe even April. It's like, how can you possibly know that? There's just not enough information.
yeah. Although I wonder if you could narrow it down on the basis of like the climate of the region, because we know travel in winter would have been
I feel like
impossible.
that's the best you can do.
But
Like
so
one
like
of them, I think
With
one letter
Timothy,
he mentions I'm going to stay here until Pentecost. And then after
yeah.
that, I'll sail to you and stay with you through the winter. It's like, okay, when after Pentecost? That could be like 3 months.
Well, yeah, that is true. That is true.
I
No, I
just think,
think
and how do you know what year? That's the thing. Like a lot of them are pinned down. It's like this was written in 54 CE. Like you cannot know that.
yeah. Although I was reading
Don't you all
Campbell's.
though?
Well, no, I mean, I'm not disagreeing necessarily, but Campbell makes a pretty good case for some of the dating. Um, well, I need to. Do you have that volume?
No.
No, I need to see if I can get like copies of that particular article because he makes a very interesting case, and he makes the case that when it comes to judging the authenticity of a Pauline document, that you don't base it on style, you don't base it on theology, you base it on biography. And so what he says is if there is information in these texts that outright contradicts what we know from other texts about the biography of Paul, then it's probably it's probably not authentic. Like when he goes to the pastorals, he notices certain anachronisms in the text that point
Mhm.
away from it being authentic. So he can rule those out pretty quick. But he says for like texts like Ephesians, Colossians, it's a little more difficult because they don't have those same kind of features. And he does not think style arguments work. He poo-poos those pretty big time. But either way, let's go back to so we got First and Second Thessalonians.
Yeah.
Assuming Second Thessalonians is authentic. What comes
Right.
next and why?
I would say the next one is probably First Corinthians.
Okay.
And I'll say real quick that this, I mean, it's obviously guesswork.
Yeah.
We're guessing based on what we can glean out of very minimal details that Paul provides.
Yeah.
So this is all an approximation. These could be like maybe this one's first compared to this one, but really it's just which ones are earlier, which ones are later, which ones are kind of in the middle, and it's an approximation rather than an exact chronology.
Yeah.
So I would say after the Thessalonian letters, the next one, the next most likely letter is probably First Corinthians, um, because it's early enough in his correspondence with the Corinthian church that he has apparently only written one previous letter to them. He
Yeah.
mentions it in First Corinthians that he's written one before,
Yeah.
but it's also early enough that he has to kind of spell out some fairly basic theological positions, or at least what to me sound like basic. Like he has an entire
Yeah.
chapter about the resurrection,
Yeah. Well,
and
and he enumerates the Lord's table. Like that seems like you would
yeah,
need that information. Like
or
that.
even how prophecy works,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
how to conduct yourself as in speaking in tongues and prophesying in the assembly. And it seems like these are kind of basic things that maybe he came to town, he found some pagan god-fearers in the synagogue, converted them and established community, and now it's maybe a year or two, three later, and they're still kind of newish, and they haven't really quite grasped all of the nuances of this messianic sect of Judaism.
Can I just say something real quick though? You talk about seeing God-fearers in the synagogue. Are you letting the Acts of the Apostles seep in there a little bit?
No, I think that's historical probability that there
Well,
were
because Paul talks about
what
like
we would
in
call Gentiles who revere or fear
no,
this
I
God of
understand that.
Israel.
I get that. But what I'm saying is like so in the Thessalonian correspondence, First Thessalonians, he talks about working night and day with them. And it almost sounds like these are Greco-Roman associations where he's joining or is adjacent to, and there in that context is proclaiming the good news. Um, but like Acts is big about Paul being in the Senate. I'm ribbing you a little bit because we're trying to do this without Acts, but
Right.
it almost seems like you can't do it without some of the presuppositions that Acts has, and maybe Acts has some historical core. I think it does. Um, I just
I
don't
think
think,
it's
you know.
the way I would look at it instead is not that we're going to Paul through Acts, it's that we're coming to some of the same conclusions about Paul that the author of Acts
Oh,
also probably did.
okay, yeah, that's a better way to put it.
That Acts author also knew about synagogues, also knew that Gentiles frequented them because they had
Yeah,
this respect for this ancient religion from Judea. And it's like, oh well, it makes sense that Paul would probably get his first Gentile converts through the synagogues.
well, and
And
that's and that's what the
I think
early
that's just historically likely.
well, that's what the early church. Well, I hate to use the word church, but the early Christ followers must have done, right? Is that they when it's centered in Jerusalem after the crucifixion, they don't leave really, and it emanates from there to the diaspora
Mm-hmm.
because they had this prophecy probably that says, well, like in Matthew, it says, you will not have gone over all the towns of Israel before the end, whatever. So they think, well, Israel is out in the world too. So let's
Mm-hmm.
go out there. And of course, they encounter pagans in those contexts, and seeing them come to the faith, to come to follow Christ, is its own fulfillment of prophecy from the Hebrew Bible that the Gentiles would come in and worship the same God. So it's kind of this, they see the effectiveness of the gospel and they read it as a indication of the end, like the end is coming near, here it comes. So it just makes sense that Paul, although, and this is not something we were going to talk about, Paul, there's no indication, there's nothing to say, especially based on his biography in Galatians, that Paul ever went to Jerusalem, um, following his conversion until many years later, and his activity is entirely diaspora. He's a
Yeah.
diasporan Jew, like that's just who he is. Um, Either way, how do we get on that topic? Good night. Um,
No, I think it's important. I mean, it's one of those reasons. Like, how do we
well, yeah.
come to conclusions about Paul?
Okay,
And
so
in
let's
this
go back
case,
though
it's
because
historical probability.
so First Corinthians, you've
Yeah,
got you've got that uh after the Thessalonian correspondence. Um, so
I think it's
obviously,
necessarily after the Thessalonians. The Thessalonian one seems to be, like you said, probably a few months, maybe a year after he visited them, whatever year that
yeah,
was. Uh, and we know from the way he describes his career, the path he took. The path he took seems to have been through Asia, over the
yeah,
Aegean Sea to Macedonia, then south to Achaia, which is where Corinth was. So by the time he gets to Corinth, he has already been to Thessalonica.
yeah,
So, and that's another detail is in First Corinthians, or yeah, I think in First Corinthians, he tells the Corinthian church that um, he first converted them when his companions included Timothy and Silvanus.
yeah. Who
And
are
those three, or Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy, happen to be the three authors of the Thessalonian letters.
yeah,
So it seems as if he wrote those Thessalonian letters during the period where he was near Corinth, maybe near Athens.
yeah. I think most scholars think Athens the most likely originating place of the Thessalonian correspondence, or at least First
Right.
Thessalonians, based on what he says in chapter 3.
Yeah.
But okay, so let's move on. Let's move on real quick. Second, so we have First Corinthians. So we have First and Second Thessalonians, or maybe Second Thessalonians and First Thessalonians. Then we have First Corinthians.
Right.
What's next in the order?
So this is where it gets difficult. Uh, Because
Really?
there is a very popular critical theory that at least one, possibly two of Paul's 7 authentic letters, 7 undisputed letters, might be composites.
Yeah.
The most agreed upon one is Second Corinthians, which scholars identify anywhere between 2 and 6 or 7 letter fragments that were stitched together to make Second Corinthians.
Yeah.
And depending on
And
how
real
many
quick, it I'll edit this after the fact, but I'll try to put
yeah,
up the chart from Albert Harrell that
yeah,
shows the
an
list so
example,
people
yeah.
can see. Yeah, yeah. But keep going, keep going.
So depending on how many letter fragments you find in Second Corinthians, that can affect on where you place those letter fragments, based on how you interpret the details that seem to refer to what's going on in Paul's career at that moment. So just to cut through it all, I'll just say that I'm a quote unquote Second Corinthians composite maximalist. I think there are 6, maybe 7 fragments. Some scholars say
Oh
2,
wow,
some say
yeah,
3 or
yeah.
4, but I think there's 6 or 7.
Yeah, I need to get you this piece by Campbell because you're gonna hate it. Because he says he thinks there is no reason to think that it's composite. He thinks that the data that suggests it is to scholars like the one I mentioned, Albert Harrell, and of course lots of others,
Yeah.
is is easily explained in other ways. And he thinks the letter of tears, which is one of the most famous of the letters within Second Corinthians that scholars mention, is actually very well could be First Corinthians. He doesn't go into like great detail about that, but again, I need to get you copies of that because that's you would hate it. Let's just put it that way. You didn't like the chronology that I sent you last week. You're gonna hate the rest of the article.
That's fine. I'll read it.
So you think so you're a maximalist with regards to that. 7 letters, 6 or 7
Up
letters.
to 6 or 7.
Are these letters, do you think they're all written around the same time? Because a letter implies a letter is just a correspondence, right, between two
Mhm.
parties. Given what we know about um travel in the Greco-Roman world, it seems like there would be a lot of time in between receiving a letter, responding to it. Like there has to be, you know what I mean? Like there's a time
Mhm.
element involved. Um, what's the turnaround on this? Like how tight of a timetable for these for these letters is there?
So 2 of them, I think, come from pretty far opposite ends of whatever time frame we're looking at. And
Okay.
these 2 are not addressed to the Corinthian church specifically. So they don't have to be restricted to him trying to get back to them real quick about emergent issues at that church in particular.
So I can understand you. You don't think that these are Corinthian specific letters, like they were
2
they
of the
were
fragments.
they were written to somebody else, like another
Uh, so
assembly.
so just to get back to our chronology, our
Yeah, yeah.
approximation, we got Second, First Thessalonians, First Corinthians, and then the next one I would say is more likely early in Paul's career of his surviving letters would be Second Corinthians chapter 8 specifically. It appears to be a letter fragment of what we might call a cyclical letter, where it is addressed not to one church to address
Yeah.
them, but to an entire region of churches. It appears to be addressed to all churches in the region of Achaia.
Like Paul's letter to the Galatians.
Right.
It's to multiple churches, and they probably
Yeah.
circulated it among themselves. Okay.
And so this specific fragment, chapter 8, seems to be addressed to all of these churches about one topic, which is his collection that he's gathering to bring a charity donation to the church in Jerusalem,
Yeah.
the assembly in Jerusalem, specifically as a gesture of goodwill to show, hey, the Gentiles out there, they're on board with Jesus, and to prove it, they're giving you this donation to show they care about you, they want to build a relationship with you,
Yeah.
and they show that they care for the poor, like they have wealth to spare,
Yeah.
and they don't want to keep it for themselves. Some people call it a bribe. I don't think that's Paul's intention. I think he genuinely
Yeah.
think he probably genuinely thought he was doing a good thing.
Oh yeah, I think so too. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's what this letter fragment appears to be. It appears to be written to all Achaean churches, including Corinth, which is probably how it got into this composite letter that they had their own copy.
Yeah.
But not just that. And it seems to be early on in Paul having come up with this collection idea, because he's like, hey, the churches in Macedonia, they're totally on board with this. They are saving up, and we want to see what you can do, how you can match them or even beat them with this donation.
Dollar for dollar, your
Right.
your pledge right now to
um, and I think I forget if it's in this chapter. It might even be in First Corinthians. Where he also mentions the collection he's gathering, where he says something
yeah.
to the effect of, once we get this all going and once we think it's ready, I'm going to send it to Jerusalem, maybe with a couple of representatives that you guys pick.
Yeah.
Paul's not at this point. Paul has no plans to accompany this donation to Jerusalem. But in other letters, when well, as we'll find out, when the collection has been gathered and is ready to go, he's changed his mind. Like
Yeah.
he's going with it to Jerusalem. In this correspondence, at least in this early part of the Corinthian correspondences, he has no plans to do that. He's planning to just send it off while he stays in the area evangelizing.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why the parts of the Corinthian correspondence are earlier in his career, at least within the framework of when he wrote his letters.
Yeah. So let me ask you this about the composite letters, because Campbell makes this point.
Yeah.
We don't have any other examples of letters in antiquity that are composite in the way these scholars suggest. And I that there's some force to that, because we don't have a way to determine, like, the only way we're determining it's composite is in the basis of details in the letter.
Hmm?
But we both know how notoriously, you know, fraught that can be, because it's usually in the eye of the beholder. Um, and he's right. I don't know of anybody from antiquity for whom we have a letter made up of all these different letters, or, I
Yeah.
mean, there's collections of letters, but that's just a different animal. Um,
Right. Cicero or Pliny.
yes, yeah, Seneca, these different, Pliny the younger and Pliny the elder. Um, do you think that there is no parallel? What I'm asking is that a problem for the theory?
So I think it is and isn't. Um, if it's true that we don't have any collections like this where it has been theorized by scholars who are specialists in those collections of letters, that we don't have any parallels of a composite letter, that would be a problem. I'm going to plead ignorance on that point because I haven't dug enough to see. I haven't dug into other collections of letters from that era to know if that's true or not.
Yeah.
If it's true, then sure, that can be a problem for the theory. On the other hand, I would say it's not necessarily, because we know that there are such things as composite documents, especially in Judeo-Christian history. We have Isaiah, we have Jeremiah, we have the Torah, we have the Gospels themselves. Those are
But
composite documents.
but in those cases, just to push back, who's doing the compiling? Like, like, you could make the argument even more specific to say we don't have any Greco-Roman analogs. Like, we don't have any examples. Like, yeah, there's Jewish examples, but these churches, these assemblies are pagans. Like, these are ex-pagans. They're not Jews. Like, we don't really have a good reason to think they're predominantly or even significantly Jewish. Um, so do the parallels from the Hebrew Bible and from Second Temple Jewish literature really inform how we determine whether it's right or not? Like, I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here.
Oh yeah, that's totally fine.
You know what I mean? Like, how best to argue for the composite hypothesis? Because I like it, mainly because I think it's cool, and that's kind of vain. That's okay. I'm all right with that. But I'm also one of those, like, just for an example, like the interpolation hypothesis for all these different texts, like the
Mm.
passage in First Thess. I hate interpolation I find it so useless. I often think it's just a way to get out of a problem when I can find ways to explain why it's in the text. I feel the same way probably about this. Like I could read this letter as if it was just a single letter. I can do
Yeah.
that. There's a way, there's strategies to do that. Um, but then again, if you put too much effort into it, that might say something about, you know, how viable it is.
Right.
Um,
Like the not to accuse you of this, but just the compulsion to defend the unified composition as opposed to a
that's
plural
definitely, that could be part
composition.
of it. Yeah. I mean, I grew up believing
Because I mean, like sometimes the simpler explanation is more likely the right one,
exactly,
but
exactly.
that's not always the case. And that it's
Yeah.
like it's a give and take where it's like it can sometimes be difficult
Yeah.
to explain why one is more likely than the other, or why the sometimes more exceptional explanation is the more likely one.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So
So I
let's,
mean, like
let's,
these are theories, and I'm totally fine with the pushback on it, like because that's how this works. Like this is, and
yes.
I'm going to pause real quick to say that's what scholarship is the push
Yeah.
forward and the push back, the give and take, the arguments for and against, and not being dogmatic about it. And sometimes just admitting that you don't have all the answers, that you don't know for certain if it's a composite or not. I don't know for certain if it's unified or not. But the fact that we can have that dialogue and not be condemnatory about it.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. You couldn't do that. You couldn't have this conversation. Well, like Derek was saying in your interview, he was talking about how he would have conversations about preterism, and he was forcefully condemned by the elders of his
Yeah.
church for teaching that. There's certain venues where you can't have these conversations. They will not
And I think
entertain them.
the academic place is where you should be able and can have those conversations.
Yeah, or right here on
Uh,
Amateur Hour with the Amateur Exegete. That's another one.
um,
Okay, let's go.
so going
So,
next,
yeah, Second Corinthians. So we've got the Thessalonian correspondence, however that's ordered. We have First
just you just need to
Corinthians.
pop it up, like just slowly build the list on screen.
Yeah,
Just
I will. That's what I'm planning to do is make it a visual. So we have the Thessalonian correspondence, First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, which is a hodgepodge, a composite
yeah.
letter, a letter of many letters.
And
Um,
I don't want to like slow us down because like we want to get through this. But at the same time, like I also like I want to say that I have a mental image of how Second Corinthians could have formed as a composite text without like it's a theory, or more properly, it's a hypothesis. It's purely hypothetical, but
okay, yeah.
I think it would be a valid illustration of how it could have happened. But we'll get to that at the end.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say one of the questions I had in relationship to that hypothesis is who did it, why, and
Right.
how. Like those are historical questions you want to ask. Okay, so
Yeah.
if we're going to save that to the end, let's do
Yeah.
that.
So the
All right.
next one I would say some like this could be who knows how long. And I think I generally favor the idea that the surviving letters of Paul, because we only have seven, maybe eight.
Yeah.
That's not a lot.
No, no, no.
Uh, but also we have to kind of balance that with it takes a long time for these to be delivered,
Yeah. Yeah.
where they were probably written over about a decade, maybe between 50 and 60 CE, give or
Okay.
take a couple years in either direction. Uh, so I don't feel the need to rush these one after the other, like breakneck speed of writing letters. Um, but sometime around maybe 53-ish CE, maybe a couple years after that, who knows exactly. Um, it seems like a rival faction of Jesus followers was starting to make a lot of progress in the same regions where Paul was,
Yeah.
where Paul's not the only evangelist out there.
Yeah,
Um,
no, not by any means.
he
Yeah.
he calls like he mentions other apostles, and in his definition, an apostle is any basically anybody who is a dedicated evangelist to the cause.
Yeah.
Like there's teachers, there's preachers, there's uh, overseers, there's servants, there's healers, there's prophets, but there's envoys, ambassadors, where
Yeah.
their job is to travel and spread the gospel. That's how Paul saw himself. That's how he saw Barnabas. It's how he saw Peter. Uh, and they're not the only ones. And being in, if you want to say, communion with Paul, what like those weren't the only people doing this. There were people who were, for lack of a better term, excommunion or excommunicated with Paul, that were
Yeah.
also evangelists, that also apostles, that were traveling the Mediterranean to Jewish and maybe Gentile communities to spread the gospel. There's no reason to doubt that this is the case, let alone the fact that Paul mentions them.
Yeah.
So the next fragment, or the next letter that I think is probably somewhere around this point in the chronology of Paul's letters, is another fragment from Second Corinthians, which is basically one paragraph from chapters 6 and 7. I think it's chapter 6, 14 through 7, verse 1, verse 2. And it's I think the first idea, or the first time I was introduced to the idea that this paragraph was an interpolation, was maybe a decade ago by, I want to say, a scholar named William Walker, where it's an entire book about
Yeah.
supposed interpolations in Paul's letters.
Yep, I'm
Some
familiar.
small
Yeah.
ones, some bigger ones, not all of them convincing. But this one in particular, I was kind of convinced by his argument that it doesn't fit Paul's style, that there are these peculiarities throughout this paragraph that are really incongruent with how he writes things. One of the biggest tip-offs is the word Beliar, the name of this
Yeah.
Satan-like deity, or demon. That word Beliar is never used anywhere else in the New Testament. Why is it used here? That's not proof that Paul didn't write it, but it should at least raise the question, why would Paul suddenly use it here when everywhere else he refers to Satan?
Yeah.
So
So
that's just one little point, but like there's other arguments, but this paragraph is incongruent with Paul.
so it's not, on that hypothesis, it's not written by Paul.
That is what
Who the hell
I
is it
am
from?
starting to think, is that this paragraph might be written by these rival evangelists, this other faction of Jesus followers, where they're going around and they, like, from what we can tell from Paul's letters, they made it through Asia, Galatia, Syria, sounds like Macedonia, definitely Achaia, uh,
Hmm.
and if they're doing the same thing Paul is, traveling around, there's no reason to think they're not also writing letters.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. Yeah. That's
It's
definitely
just,
the case.
that's a historical certainty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it is possible, maybe probable, that this paragraph is a fragment from one of their letters, also written to the Corinthian church against Paul.
Okay. So, so now you're just teasing because you keep saying we're gonna talk about this at the end, but this again raises the question of who is doing this compilation work and why. And that kind of thing, if that's true that this is a text not written by Paul, written by his opponents, to include it in the letter, into the composite document that you're making. And this is something they must have done intentionally, right? You don't accidentally make a compilation. Like this is something they must have
Right.
intentionally done. Why include it? Did they mistake it for Paul? Did they? I mean, that's the only thing I can think of that could plausibly explain it. I don't see why you would throw that monkey wrench in there in the midst of Paul's words.
Yeah.
It must, you must have been, I don't know. It's very, that's a strange argument to me. I mean, it's
For
not
sure.
implausible, but it's very odd. And my
Yeah.
my gut reaction, of course, like I said, is to reject it because I just do not like interpolation hypothesis. I think they are lazy.
Composite is just a fancy way of saying interpolate.
Yeah, well, yeah. Okay.
So the reason I'm starting to be convinced. And I say starting to be because I'm this theory is relatively new to me.
Yeah.
But the points that I see in favor of it are, first of all, there's that weird little thing. Why Beliar? Why not
Yeah.
Satan? That's not typical of Paul. It's very, very untypical of him.
Yeah.
Um, then you look at the way that Paul uses, like the way he cites passages from the Hebrew scriptures. And the way it's done in this paragraph, it doesn't really resemble the way he does it. Not to say he couldn't have done it really weirdly in this occasion, but it brings up the question, why would he do it so differently? Where normally Paul will cite, here's a line from Isaiah, here's a line from the Psalms, here's a line from Exodus, but he'll usually say something like, as it is written, da 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 da.
Yeah, yeah.
And if he's citing more than one text at a time, he will usually break them apart by saying, and also here, da da da, and also here, etc., etc. Whereas in this one, it's blending like 3 or 4 different passages, just mushing them together. And you have to really kind of figure out, oh, I think it's getting like Exodus here, and it's maybe this psalm here. First Samuel 7, what are you doing? Or Second Samuel 7, whatever it is.
Yeah. So it's not, you're saying
It's
it's
just
not
kinda mushing
Paul's
them.
practice. It's not the way he
Yeah.
typically treats those texts. Okay. Yeah.
So, and then you look at the point that this paragraph is making. It kind of interrupts the thought process before and after, where Paul's talking about, he's writing to the Corinthian church, like, you're in our hearts, you're in our thoughts, we think about you, you mean a lot to us. And then after that paragraph, it goes right back to that thought process. But in that paragraph, he's suddenly changing what he's talking about, where stay away from unbelievers, don't mix together with them, we must separate from the world, and blah. It's like suddenly we means we, all of us, all Christians, all followers of Jesus, believers, whereas before and after, we is Paul and his companions, and you are the Corinthians.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's this really weird jump. So it seems to, when you take it apart, when you set it aside and read it, or try to look at it from a different perspective as maybe not Paul's, then who? It seems to be written by this rival faction of Jesus followers who are, for lack of a better term, Torah mandatory. That you have to follow the Torah to follow Jesus.
Yeah,
Gentile converts,
pagans,
you got to fully convert.
Yeah, circumcise the whole
Whereas
bit.
Paul doesn't say that. Like, Paul is Torah voluntary for Gentiles, Torah prohibited for Gentiles, whatever it is for Paul.
Or it's Paul Judaize the way I want you to, not the way they want you to. That's the way
so
Paul
this fragment, this passage, this paragraph seems to be a fragment from a letter written by Paul's opponents to the Corinthian church to dissuade them from following Paul's theology, where it says believers, our faction, should not mix with unbelievers, like that Paul guy. He's an unbeliever. He doesn't trust God's commands, because that's all unbeliever is. Paul calls these rivals false brothers. So they're slinging these insults and accusations against each other about being false and fake and unbelievers and untrusters and whatever. The fragment says, what does justice or righteousness have to do with lawlessness? Because they're accusing Paul of not following the law.
Free. Yeah.
Don't mix light and dark, and don't mix the Messiah with Beliar. They're calling him a Beliar follower, whereas he calls them, even Satan is disguised as an angel of light. That's what he says about them. So they're flinging these insults, the same kinds of insults at each other, but for different reasons. And the passage
it's
seems
different
to
language
separate from unbelievers like Paul's side.
Yeah.
So that's just the way I read it, and I think that theory has a lot of merit to it for that fragment.
Yeah.
If not, you could kind of make it make sense within the context, but it's like you have to have this 7-8 verse long paragraph that is entirely parenthetical to Paul's thought, whatever he's talking about before and after.
Yeah. Although, again, I come back to the fact that the ability to explain why it's there, I think, becomes difficult. Like, you've got to have a good way to account for why an author or the compiler would include that text, where they do. Like, unless it's just a haphazard collection of texts. Like, I just don't. Well, I mean, to be fair, I haven't looked into it as much as you have. I'm familiar with the idea of multiple letters, but I just haven't invested the energy into, like, mainly because I don't have time. I'm way more interested lately in the Epistle of James, but uh still, like, I just, it's hard to go, it's hard to fight that gut reaction
Yeah,
that I've got built inside of me. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so hard because I see it so often. Well, you know what it is? It's mythicists, because they often appeal to interpolations,
yeah, yep.
and I hate it so much. It just gets under my skin. So whenever I find it in more not conservative, but more academically minded, like, scholars, um it just it just ugh, it's icky. I don't like it. um
Yeah.
okay, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to get back to Pauline, the Pauline corpus and the order.
We got to
And
bang these out. We got to get through them faster now.
we well, we're on what, Second Corinthians still. We got how many letters left? Like four. Yeah, this is topic number 2 of the
12.
list that we have. So, all right, we'll be right back. I can't tell you how much I hate interpolation theory. I just, oh, it just, mythicists have ruined it for me. It's their fault, probably. But that volume by Walker that you mentioned,
Yeah.
um, uh, when I was doing my series on First Thessalonians, and looking into the possibility that that passage in chapter 2 is interpolation,
Yeah.
I was reading through some of this stuff, and I was like, no, no, there's a way to read this passage and it fits perfectly. It's just, you stop it. It's not interpolation.
Include this. Keep this in the video, the final video.
Oh, this
Because I'll point
conversation.
this out. Yeah, because so the passage you're talking about is First Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 13 through 16.
Okay, so just for a second, so viewers, this is raw. We're just going into it. I'm not, usually I would start with some spiel. Mark has made an executive decision to just let us fly. So let's get into First Thessalonians 2. Go ahead.
So we're rewinding a bit in our discussion about
Yeah.
chronological Paul. And so there's a popular theory. I would say it's popular among non-academics, that it's very commonly pointed out by people who are getting into academics, but it's not very popular among actual scholarship.
No, yeah, yeah.
Uh, the idea is First Thessalonians 2, verses 13 through 16, or at least some of that may be an interpolation into Paul's letter, that it was written by somebody much later than Paul. And the reason people think this is that section seems to be oddly hostile to Jews.
Yes, yeah.
And Paul is a Jew, so why is he so hostile to Jews? It seems to be atypical of Paul. And it concludes with the phrase, God's wrath has come upon them at last,
Yeah.
which is commonly interpreted as a reference to the year 70 CE, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and basically restarted the Jewish diaspora.
Yeah.
Like allegedly killed millions and enslaved millions more. Just one of the most horrific moments in Jewish history in the first century. And so readers see this, like, it sounds like it's referring to 70 CE. It can't possibly be about anything else. Like, okay, let's slow down. I'm saying this as somebody who used to be convinced of this. I am no longer convinced that it's an interpolation, but I used to be, because of books like William Walker. And the reason it doesn't, now that I have gotten more into academics and I see the arguments for and against, I'm convinced that the arguments for are much weaker than it seems at first, and the arguments against are much stronger.
Yeah.
The reason it probably isn't about 70 CE is because yes, Paul does seem to be oddly hostile to Jews there, but he's referring literally to people from Judea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, he's referring to the people who live in that land or are Jewish and
Well,
have
the and
been
the argument
hostile
hinges on that.
to what?
His argument hinges on that, because he's talking about,
Yeah,
he's comparing it to the Thessalonians experience, and that only works if he's talking about the Thessalonians' immediate vicinity.
yeah.
So it
So
has to be, yeah.
the mistake that seems to be made when people read this is he mentions Jews, and he mentions Judea,
Yeah.
and therefore people read Jews in Judea.
Yeah.
And that's like, okay, the wrath that has come upon the Jews in Judea, it's got to be 70 CE. There's
Yeah.
nothing anywhere near that bad in the first century. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
you gotta, there's like a 2 or 3 sentence pause between the mentions of Jews and Judea. And whatever the wrath that he's talking about, he's not isolating it to Judea. He's just saying something has happened to Jewish communities. And yeah, that can be interpreted as oddly hostile from a Jewish writer about Jews, but keep Paul in his context. He's a Jewish man who
Yeah.
is super versed in Jewish theology, lore, legends, Haggadah, Midrash, the scriptures, and that's not unusual. Go read the Dead Sea
I was
Scrolls.
just gonna
Those
say,
dudes are
look at
so
Qumran.
hostile to other Jews.
Yeah.
It should not be interpreted as an anti-Semitic thing, which it's not comfortable to read. It's not good,
Yeah.
but it's not anti-Semitic because you go read the Dead Sea Scrolls and those things are horrifically condemnatory against other Jews, seeing them as false Israelites and
as sons of
that
darkness.
they deserve God's wrath.
Yeah.
And they're basically Gentiles with how impure they are in regards to Torah observance and so on and so on. So like it's an inner debate that Paul is having, not a Jew against outsiders or outsiders against Jews. It's a Jewish guy talking about his own people, as opposed to the Thessalonians or Corinthians or whoever. So anyway, it's probably not an interpolation in First Thessalonians 2.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's a couple good. So Timothy Brookins has a commentary on First and Second Thessalonians for Paideia, that series from Baker Academic, and he makes some really good points on this. So anybody who wants a inexpensive commentary, but it's very academic by a reputable scholar, that's Timothy Brookins, and he makes some really good points on that. And I always took the reference at the end to the wrath of God is coming upon them at last. That error, it's an aorist verb, but I took it as like a proleptic aorist, like it's so certain. It's a future event, but it's so certain that it's going to happen. It's as if it's a past event. It's already happened. That's how.
And there is a parallel for this in Paul's letters, Romans 1, where he talks about God's wrath, and whether that's Paul himself talking or he's giving a voice to a hypothetical debate opponent, whatever the point is.
Yeah,
the language used is essentially the same.
Yeah,
that God's wrath is coming or has come or like it's here, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it's really not very atypical, Paul, when you get down into the details.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's go back to the topic that we were in, that we spent forever in because I asked too many questions. So we were going through the order of Paul's letters when he wrote them.
Yep.
We have the Thessalonian correspondence, and I'll put a thing up so that people can kind of follow along. Yeah, it won't be that sophisticated, Mark. Okay, I'm a little bit.
I'm just picturing like bullet points.
Oh, you want to get that fancy? Okay.
Just a stream of text of bullet points going like across our faces on the screen.
Oh yeah, that would not be irritating at all. So Thessalonians, what do we say? First Corinthians, and then the mess.
First Thessalonians, First Corinthians,
the mess of Second
fragment,
Corinthians.
Second Corinthians 8,
garbage
as a fundraising cyclical letter, and then a possible fragment from a letter from Paul's opponents to the Corinthian church, basically saying don't believe Paul.
Yeah, which is.
And I still want to get into my hypothesis of how it could have happened, but set that aside for a moment.
I mean, you want to wait to the very end after we get through all the letters to do that?
Yep.
It seems so strange, but maybe maybe you're teasing something big. Okay, so all right, we've got the Corinthian correspondence is finished, right? So we got First Corinthians, the mess that is Second Corinthians. You have seemingly teased, and I think I know what's coming next. I think Galatians.
No, but we're getting there.
So you don't think Galatians is next?
Close. So Paul seems to have he's starting to hear about churches here and there are starting to question or reject his authority.
Yeah, buck the.
And one of the earlier ones may be the church in Corinth. And he's like, he's confused. He's like, why? Like, they think I'm exploiting them somehow, like for personal gain. How could they possibly
Yeah.
think that?
And that
So
seems
he writes a
like a
letter.
frequent concern of Paul, by the way. Paul seems to
Yeah.
have this little almost like a complex about that kind of thing. Like
So,
I don't
well,
want you
he's
to
got
think
this
I'm
rival
doing it for
faction
personal
spreading
gain.
rumors about him.
Well, yeah. Yeah, well, yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's hearing that some of his churches that he's founded or that he has built a relationship with, or like they're starting to question him. So he,
Yeah.
like one of them, he writes a letter to him, and he writes a letter to Corinth, and this is a large part of Second Corinthians chapters 2 through 7.
Are we still in Second Corinthians, Mark?
Yep. Yeah.
God.
So this is not the letter of tears that you mentioned earlier, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's a kind of he's defensive. Like he's trying to justify his ministries. Like, how could you think I'm exploiting you? Like,
That's Paul all the
here's
time,
this
though.
thing, here's that thing. Like, you can see I'm committed to this. I go around and I here's the
Yeah.
things I do. You're in my heart. I wish you would keep me in your heart, etc., etc.
Yeah, yeah.
A few months, maybe a year later, like these stories that he's hearing, it's like, oh, these churches are questioning me. This one's over here, like they've outright said they don't want to hear from me again or whatever. So he starts to hear this from churches closer to where he is, such as in Galatia, and he's pissed off. So he writes this horribly bitter, angry letter to the Galatian churches, just all of them. It's like, who
Oh
tricked
yeah,
you?
he's pissed.
This rival faction, what, and I don't even know if this term is from Paul's letters. As far as I remember, it's not. They are Judaizers,
Yeah, yeah.
where I prefer the term Torah mandatory, because that's what their position seems to be, that they are requiring Gentile converts to fully convert to Judaism, which means they have to follow Torah.
Yeah, but well, Paula Frederickson makes the point that when Paul talks about the Judaizers, he wants them to Judaize too. He just wants them to do it the way he wants them to do it.
Right.
Like he's got a particular way he wants them to.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, you're right. He's not Torah free. He's not law free, but he's not like you said, you don't have to keep circumcision or things
Yeah.
like that. But yeah.
So Paul's like, he's angry. He's like, these stories coming to him are like taking him off, and so he hears about this. Just apparently, all of the churches in Galatia seem to, at least as far as his letter implies, have doubted or rejected his authority. And Galatians, this is part of that reconstruction of like getting the clues from references to people, places, and events in the
Yeah.
letters to try and approximate the order they were written in. In one of his earlier letters to the Corinthian church, he says, "Hey, I'm going to be talking to you guys about this collection. I want you to try and follow the instructions I gave to the Galatian churches about this collection, which is, every so often, whatever it is, how to get money without guilting people into doing it. That they should give voluntarily rather than be like, you gotta lean on them to do it."
Yeah.
That's what he says to the Corinthians.
Yeah.
And then he writes this letter to the Galatian churches. And then it seems like from that point onward, the Galatians are out of the collection. Other letters, when he starts saying like, "Oh, we're getting ready to gather it up. Hey, I've gathered it up," there's no mention of Galatia again.
Yeah. I've never thought of that.
The implication, or rather the reader inference that I have, is maybe his letter to the Galatian churches, they didn't receive it very well, and they said, "Okay, we're done with you, Paul. Hands off.
Yeah.
We're not donating."
Huh.
That's a possibility, and I think that kind of plays into a possible reconstruction of the order, of how we can kind of place letters relative to each other.
Okay. Okay. I'd have to. I need to think on that because, yeah, I just need to think on that.
What Paul's, like, what his career seems to have been is he would go northward relative to Jerusalem and Judea. He would go northward through Asia. Sorry, I'm doing it backward to my camera. He would go upward through Asia, Syria, Cilicia, Galatia, and then across the Aegean Sea to Macedonia, then south to Achaia, and then he would sail back east toward Jerusalem, and he seems to have made this trip 3, maybe 4 times. And
yeah.
once we get to the point where he's writing to the Galatian churches and he's just ticked off at them, he doesn't seem to go back to Galatia. He kind of restricts himself to Asia, Syria, and then Macedonia and Achaia.
John, memory, does Galatia ever come up in the Acts of the Apostles? I can't remember if that author ever mentions.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Well, okay. Well, that's
the reason it's not fresh in my memory is because when I was trying to figure out this approximate chronology, I didn't look at Acts at all. I wanted to keep it out and see what we could get from just Paul's letters.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So he writes to Galatia, and I think around this time, maybe within a month or two, or even at the same time, who knows exactly, is when he writes his angry letter, his bitter letter to Corinth, what we would identify as 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13.
Yeah.
Where he's like, he's railing on these super apostles or false apostles, pseudo apostles is what he calls them.
You're saying you're placing Galatians right before this letter. I mean, and not
necessarily before, but like around the same time.
Okay.
The exact order to me doesn't matter, but like they're around the same time, probably because they're in response to this now emergent problem. Whereas before he's answering like these questions about resurrection and the second coming and the fundraiser, and now he's got to put out these fires with this rival faction making a lot of progress where he claims to have created these churches.
Yeah. No, yeah, that makes sense.
So he's got to put out fires in Galatia. He's got to put it out in Corinth now.
Yeah.
How can you believe these guys? They say that they're Hebrews. I'm a Hebrew. They say that they're descendants of Abraham. I'm a descendant of Abraham. They say they work for Jesus. I'm a better worker for Jesus.
Yeah.
I'll brag about my suffering. I'll brag about beatings and whippings I've received and shipwrecks, and I'll even brag about some other guy's visions that he might have had. Nobody important. But it's like it's the same kind of bitterness that we see in Galatians, where he's angry, he's ticked off. How can these people question my commitment?
He's in a mood. That's what.
And if Philippians, the other letter that some scholars think is a composite, if Philippians is a composite, I think part of chapter 3 might come from the same time period, because he does the same thing that he does in 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, where it's like, beware of the dogs, beware of the unbelievers, beware of the people who want to mutilate your flesh, circumcision. They say that they're Jews. I'm the better Jew. They say that they're from the tribe of Israel. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I know which one I'm from. It's the exact same thing he says in 2 Corinthians. So that seems to be around the same time, if it's also a composite.
Okay.
Fragment.
All right. So we have Galatians with this letter.
Yeah, maybe the mid 50s, maybe the beginning of the second half of the 50s CE. He's now focusing on defending his reputation, and he's writing letters all over the place to defend himself and to justify his version, his understanding of the gospel, and why these guys are the frauds, not him.
Yeah, he's in panic mode. It sounds like he's really, really, like a celebrity that's been caught in a scandal, and he's just trying to, this PR move to kind of to shore up support. Okay, so Philippians,
a fragment in chapter 3.
Yeah, so it could be composite if that's right. So what do we have left? We have Romans, we have Philemon, we have
still got parts of 2 Corinthians and still got parts of Philippians.
God, Mark, come on now. I mean, really? More of second. This letter is and we haven't even gotten to why you think it, like who did it and why and all that.
So maybe in the next couple of months, maybe a year from there, who knows exactly how long, Paul hears back. The people, the believers in Corinth have apparently decided to accept his authority. That they now believe he's sincere. He's not exploiting them. He knows what he's talking about. His version of the gospel, maybe they like it more. Hey, he's got a good argument about why we don't have to go through this horrific medical process. But whatever the reason is, whatever it was that convinced them, the church in Corinth now accepts Paul.
Yeah. Okay.
And he's happy about this. So he writes back to them to say, hey, we're good. But here's the reason why most scholars think that Second Corinthians is at least 2 letter fragments, if not more. The second part of Second Corinthians, primarily chapters 10 through 13, Paul is threatening Corinth, where he says, hey, I was planning to do this and this and this, but I'm going to drop my plans right now, and I'm coming straight to Corinth. I'm going to kick all your asses. He says specifically, this will be my 3rd visit. It'll be the 3rd time I come to see you.
Yeah.
And he even alludes how his previous visit was really tense. Apparently, he left on some not so good terms with certain members of that church. And so now he's threatening, I'm going to come to you for a 3rd time, and I'm going to show you what's what.
Yeah.
But in the first part of Second Corinthians, somewhere in chapters 1 through 7, he says, I've decided not to come visit you. I was planning to go here, and then I was kind of going to come to you guys first, and then go up there, and then come back for a 4th time. I've decided to spare you of this painful visit.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense if that was all, to me, it doesn't make sense if all of Second Corinthians is one unified composition, because he says, I've decided to spare you a painful visit. And then at the end of the letter, he says, I'm coming to beat you all up theologically and spiritually and maybe physically slap a few in the head.
Yeah. That's a big swing there. Yeah. Yeah.
It seems at least 2 pieces, if not more, are out of order. So he's on good terms with Corinth now. And it seems like maybe he's on better terms with the church in Philippi. If they were even on bad terms with him, he might have just been preemptively defending himself to the Philippians, like worried that they were going to turn on him. But now he's on good terms. And from what he has written in previous letters to Corinth and elsewhere, it seems like the Philippians have always been on his side. Like he mentions how when he came to visit Corinth, the Philippians were the only church in Macedonia to basically finance his travels, that they gave him this amazing gift to help get him where he was going.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'd never bothered the Corinthians with helping me out. The Philippians had me covered.
Yeah.
So now in Philippians 4, he says, hey, thanks for this great gift you've sent me. And you sent it through this guy Epaphroditus. Like you've sent him to me. He just showed up. He got the gifts. He brought the gifts to me, and like, thank you so much. Like it's a thank you note. This part of Philippians 4. So he's on kind of like, he's maybe on the mend, like he's kind of settling down up here.
Yeah, he's calming down, yeah.
And now he's back on his mission, and he's going on his travels again. And it seems like he's finally on the last leg of his career at this point of the letters, anyway. Who knows how long his career extended beyond the letters. But within the letters we have, it seems like we're kind of getting near the end, because now he's starting to write about gathering the collection, that donation for the poor in Jerusalem. But oops, he gets arrested.
Yeah.
Him and some of his companions, but apparently not all of them. It seems like the way he describes his arrest, it's some of his companions, but not everybody in his group. It seems like Timothy's not in jail. But it sounds like Epaphroditus is in jail with him. Oops. The guy comes to bring him a gift, and then they get arrested together.
They nab him. You can't carry large amounts of cash like that. They're going to get you every time. I mean, it's just...
So this brings us to Philemon, where he talks about he's a prisoner, and he's using the fact that he's a prisoner to guilt trip Philemon to do what he wants.
Yeah.
The letters to Philemon is a class act in how to manipulate somebody emotionally.
It really is. So if anybody watching this, I did, for Bible Study for Amateurs, my podcast, I did a series on Philemon, and I note the places where he is just a master manipulator, and he makes it sound so smooth. You want to do stuff for Paul, you know what I mean? But he is just
and in Philemon, he mentions how one of his jailed companions is a guy named Epaphras. It's just the nickname version of Epaphroditus.
Yeah.
Then we come to Philippians chapters 1 through 3. So now this is the last part of Philippians, where it seems to be after chapter 4. Chapter 4, Epaphroditus has just showed up. Paul just received the gifts from the Philippian church, and he's writing this thank you note. But in the first 3 chapters, he mentions how Epaphroditus has apparently been with Paul for quite a while, long enough he has fallen ill, long enough that he fell ill and nearly died, and long enough that he is now almost recovered and he's eager to get home. It's been a while since he's been with Paul. So again, this seems to be the main point of evidence for why some scholars think Philippians is a composite also, because it's got this kind of contradictory information about what's going on with Epaphroditus.
Yeah.
So he writes that from prison also. Exactly how is up for anyone to guess. My personal theory is maybe he's dictating to Timothy through the window of his jail, whatever it is. Maybe the jailers were kind and let him write something. Who knows?
Yeah. And real quick, Candida Moss has a new book out on slavery in the composition of the New Testament or the creation of the Bible, and she talks about some of these issues and how enslaved workers were probably used. Like you said, Paul is dictating to a slave outside who's a scribe, and to get the letters out that he needs to get out while he's in prison. So I really recommend that book. It's really good.
Yeah.
But anyway, so keep going, keep going.
So this is where I think the last fragment in Second Corinthians comes from. He's been in jail. He's out now, and he's ready to he wants to get this collection. So maybe he was jailed in Ephesus, which is where some of his letters were written.
Yeah.
So he's finally out of jail. He sails back across the Aegean Sea. He gets to Macedonia, and he's gathering the collection, and their donation's ready. They've had it ready for a while. Paul comes into Philippi and to Thessalonica, and he gets their donations, and now he wants to go down to Achaia, to Corinth, and to Athens and Cenchreae, whatever that town is. It's a little town near Corinth. But he wants to make sure they're ready first. So he writes another small letter to all of the churches in that region, kind of like the one earlier in his career. Yeah. So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 9, where he says, hey, Macedonia is ready. Their collections are here. I'm sending this note with a few of my friends down to the churches in Achaia because we want to make sure you guys are ready before I get there, because I'm not coming alone. Some of the Macedonians are coming with me. I would hate to be embarrassed. I would hate for you to be embarrassed. Let's get this sorted out before we arrive.
Okay.
So, but the point is, chapter 9, he's coming to get the donation. Now we're at the last letter of Paul, which is Romans.
This took forever.
Took forever. Romans, he's kind of cooled off. Maybe he's learned something from his experience with the Galatian churches, because Romans really, really reads like a very refined version of what he wrote to Galatia, where it's a lot of the same arguments.
Yeah.
The distinction of Jews and Gentiles, of circumcision and whether it's beneficial or not. The same example of Abraham and the circumcision of Isaac, and when Abraham was justified by faith, and whether that means following the Torah. It's all the same stuff, but it's much more refined. It's more of what we could call a treatise. And Paul, he says in chapter 15, I've gone everywhere from Jerusalem to Illyricum, which is a province northwest of Achaia in Macedonia, all across the Mediterranean Sea. I'm ready to go to the next stage of my career, which is I want to visit you in Rome for the first time, because I've never been there. I want you guys to welcome me. And then from there, I will go off to Spain, and maybe you guys can see me off if we get along well. So he's writing Rome to say, hey, I've got the collection. I'm on my way to Jerusalem with it right now. We're about to leave Corinth or Athens or wherever he is.
Yeah.
And then he adds chapter 16 as kind of a postscript, where he's like, hey, send greetings to this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy, and from this guy and this guy and this guy. And he mentions that he's sending Phoebe from Cenchreae, that little town near Corinth, and she's the one carrying Romans, she's delivering the letter for him. But he mentions but he mentions we've got the collection, we're on our way to Jerusalem right now.
Yeah. So
he's about to depart, go across the Mediterranean back to Jerusalem, and he kind of anticipates some trouble when he gets back to town. He mentions, I forget the exact wording, but I think it's either Romans 15 or 16. He mentions maybe running into the unbelievers or something like that, which in context, it doesn't necessarily mean Gentile authorities. It could mean that rival faction that he's kind of been mudslinging with.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Okay.
So Romans, at the very least, Romans has to be the very last of the surviving letters of Paul, because he's got the collection, he's on his way. And after
Yeah.
that, we don't hear anything else about what happened. We
Yeah.
just have the book of Acts kind of maybe
Yep.
making up a story for like a nice little bow on that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back real quick. Let's because we need to start wrapping it up, but let's talk
Yeah.
about the compilation of Second Corinthians in brief. What's your hypothesis?
Here's my stupid theory that if Corinth is like Paul's writing letters, but he's not the only one. The rivals are writing
Yeah.
letters too. And Corinth is receiving these letters, and they were apparently influenced by the opinion of Paul's rivals, because that's why they
Oh,
started to doubt him in
yeah,
the
yeah.
first place. Which, in my dumb theory, could indicate that they're hanging on to the same, like the not just Paul's letters, but the letters of his rivals, and they're collecting them. And it's
Okay. Yeah.
this written conversation that they're trying to keep track of. Like, here's what they said, here's what they said, and they're just keeping them together. And like, we got these rolled up papyri and got a storm here, so like we can consult them every now and then. So hypothetically, let's say maybe 20, 30, 40 years pass by. We're getting to like the 80s or even the early 90s
Yeah.
of the first century. And we're a whole generation or two later. And this new rising group of Christians in Corinth, they don't have the context that their parents had. I mean, how many people today know what politics were
Yeah.
like 20, 30 years ago? And we have a proliferation of information on the internet that is so
Exactly.
easily available to us, let alone people where they didn't have that kind of information at their fingertips.
Yeah.
And they've got their own situations coming up, like how to live, how to show the Roman Empire that you're good citizens when you're waiting for this return of Jesus that you're not so sure is going to happen imminently anymore. So you got new things to worry about. So they're not familiar with this context of this rival faction of Paul's, with the debate about Gentiles and Torah, but they still have this collection of letters, but maybe they haven't been consulting it as often. Maybe it's kind of languished in a clay jar for a couple of years,
Yeah.
right? Like the documents at the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, like they were stored in these jars, and not all of them were stored very well. So hypothetically, maybe some of these Corinthian letters were not stored well, and by the time somebody's like, "Oh, let's go check this thing," and they find them, some of them are just in shambles. They can't read them. This is all hypothetical, but I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah,
something
yeah.
we could consider.
That's
That some of them are in
interesting.
shambles, some of them are fragmented. Maybe they were stored too dry and they crumbled, or maybe they were too wet and they molded or something. Who knows? But they want to save what they can. First Corinthians, it passes in flying colors. It's preserved with almost nothing lost. But there's a previous letter before First Corinthians that's entirely lost. It
Yeah,
was
it's gone.
damaged too
Yeah.
much to read. But then what we have for Second Corinthians, maybe that was a handful of other letters that survived, like a fragment of this one, a fragment of that one. Here's a fragment from a letter from Paul's rivals, but this group of Christians doesn't know that anymore because it's damaged.
Yeah.
But we got to save this stuff because it's important, and look at it. We got to save what we can. How about we stitch together what seems to make sense? We'll look at it, we'll read these parts, whatever seems to make sense context wise, we'll stitch that together, or we'll rewrite it on a new like draft of papyrus.
Yeah.
And that could be
Yeah.
how, not just how Paul's letters became a composite, but how Paul's letter and maybe a fragment of one of his rivals became
Yeah.
a single composite attributed to one dude.
That
All a theory. It's super
nah,
dumb, but I
nah,
think it's at least
I'd buy it.
historically plausible enough that we should think about it any more than we think about how Mark was written in conversation with Greco-Roman stories about rumors about tombs and
Yeah, yeah,
healings by
yeah.
Vespasian or whatever.
Okay.
So there you go.
All right. I mean, I don't know. I'll have to think about that. That's interesting. So we're almost out of time. Real quick. Real quick. We got like 3 minutes. Um, I want to close out with maybe just briefly going, talk about a book you've been reading lately or an article that's kind of struck you. Um, you know, so shoot, tell me.
So As you can tell, I've been kind of reading about Paul lately.
No.
Uh, some books by there's a book by Harrell that I'm partway through, recommended by Ben here. I reread, kind of speed read through Pamela Eisenbaum's book, Paul Was Not a Christian.
That's a good book.
Took a lot of notes on it, but there was a couple of chapters I skipped just because I didn't feel like I needed to read those in particular. I really like that book. I feel like it concludes really oddly. One part of her book is she mentions how the main catalyst for why Paul does what he does is because he's driven by the end times. Specifically, you got to get right with God or his wrath is going to destroy you.
Yeah.
But then she closes out her book by saying, if we read Paul in all the way that I've recommended, it could be a good way to open up conversation for religious pluralism.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not what you were talking about with Paul's letters.
Those two don't mix. Yeah. Yeah.
It was just a weird way to end the book.
Yeah.
But I've also been reading some of the Paul within Judaism stuff from Mark Nanos and Zetterholm and so on.
Good stuff. I like that stuff.
Been doing some light reading on Marcion's Gospel. I'm just gonna. I have this stuff written down about what I've been reading. I'm gonna hit through that. Klinghardt, Roth, Badun, just because I think it needs more attention when it comes to the synoptic problem.
Okay.
And speaking of Stoic literature, I have actually been reading the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius lately.
Those are good. Yeah, I like those. Yeah, it's I've got
I kind of hate it.
editions. I like it. It's just
I really appreciate a lot of Stoic philosophy, but Marcus Aurelius seems like a walking contradiction. And some of the stuff he says doesn't seem quite so Stoic, so much as a Stoic veneer over classism.
Yeah. I mean, I think
he
that's
says
true.
something to the effect of people lower in society, lower beings, exist to serve higher beings, and the higher beings, like me, the philosopher emperor, we're made to be in charge.
He's kind of a snob sometimes. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. So
I've also been reading a lot of sci-fi fiction, and I've been gathering resources to try and dig into Mandeism.
Okay, yeah.
So there you go. That's me.
Well, good.
We got less than a minute. Go.
Yeah, so I'll just say I have a review coming out soon, hopefully next week or the week after, of a book on gospel composition by Nicholas Elder. So everyone should look out for that. The book is called Gospel Media, but everyone should get that. But either way, Mark, thank you for doing this with me. I hope we can do it again soon because we got a lot more to talk about. And I'll see you around then. Thanks everybody for watching. Bye-bye.